For 10 years, I believed I was building a quiet, ordinary life. Until one shower, one message, and one unfamiliar smile shattered it all. But what began as betrayal soon spiraled into something deeper. A hidden web of names, places that don't exist, and a man who may never have been real. I always believed trust was the bedrock of my marriage, and I carried that conviction like a shield through a decade of routines, holidays, and shared plans that felt as solid as brick and wood. We had a house where friends laughed around the table, and we spoke often of travel and children and all the expected milestones that mark a steady life. I thought of us as ordinary in the safest way, predictable in a way I cherished. Then came the night when everything I held steady cracked. He stepped into the shower and left his phone glowing on the counter. A message still open. I did not mean to pry. My eyes landed on it the way a hand reaches for balance when the ground shifts. The photo showed a woman I had never seen. Her smile was not tentative, carried the easy grace of belonging. The words beneath it read casual and familiar. Not the sort of exchange that begins with formality, but the sort that grows after years of private comfort. At first I forced myself toward reason. A coworker, perhaps. An old friend who never surfaced in our conversations. Some forgotten link from a past before me. Yet the tone unsettled me. I heard the water running behind the closed door, and in that sound the quiet of our home turned unsteady. I kept staring at that picture until it no longer looked like pixels on a screen but a doorway into a hidden room of his life. I tapped further. The phone offered me more than one thread. Long strings of words that spoke of weekends together. Weekends that I knew had not happened. They laughed about details I never heard in my own conversations with him. She called him by a name I had never once spoken. Every word struck like a brick pulled loose from the wall I had trusted to stand strong. Then I reached a line that stopped me cold. She spoke of a child. The shower ended and I heard him moving. My pulse thudded so loudly I thought the sound might fill the room. When he came out, I asked about her. My voice sounded almost calm, though my body told a different story. I expected denial, perhaps a clumsy explanation. But what I received was silence weighted with something heavier than guilt. His eyes did not plead. They carried fear. In that instant I knew this was larger than betrayal. I had stumbled into a life folded within another life. He sat on the edge of the bed with the towel still across his shoulders. His hands clenched as if bracing for impact. He did not answer right away, and I pressed again until finally he gave words to what I already feared. There was another phone. Another name, another home, another woman waiting. He did not call it an affair. He described it as if he were reciting logistics. A schedule kept too long. A balance maintained until it faltered. The shock was not only in the lie itself but in the realization that I had been the hidden one. She knew him as the man who came home tired from work. She had photographs of trips I never knew. Weekends when he claimed late hours were in truth hers. He had constructed two complete lives and managed to keep them standing side by side with only the smallest cracks. I thought back over the years and saw patterns form where once I had seen only noise. Bank statements with gaps. Late nights that did not match the workload he described. Stories about his past that bent and reshaped depending on the day. I remembered once asking about a scar on his arm. He gave me 2 different answers in 2 different weeks. At the time I laughed. Now I understood I had been laughing at a mask. But I could not leave the matter sitting in the shadows. I reached out to her. The woman in the picture. The stranger who appeared to live so comfortably in a parallel version of my life. We arranged to meet. I walked into that cafe thinking she must know. That she must have played her part willingly. When I saw her face, I knew instantly I was wrong. She looked at me with confusion first, then with dawning horror. We sat across the table and the truth unfolded like a map we had both been walking without ever knowing it. She thought I was the other woman. Her shock was genuine and it mirrored my own. We began comparing timelines the way detectives might cross-check alibis. She spoke of weekends away that lined up precisely with the times he had told me he was trapped at the office. She described gifts that matched receipts I had once seen but never received. The pattern grew undeniable. Every promise he had whispered to me, he had echoed to her with the same tone and the same certainty. What struck me most was her insistence that he was a good man. She said he worked hard, that he was kind, that he cared for her child with the patience of a father. That word hung heavy between us. Child. I asked her to explain, and she did with a softness that only deepened my unease. He had attended birthdays. He had helped with homework. He had stood beside her as though the boy was his own. I felt the room tilt as I realized I was not only sharing a husband. I was sharing the illusion of a family that had been built without me knowing. Yet, as our conversation stretched, I noticed cracks even in her story. She did not know the full breadth of his past. The job he claimed to hold seemed vague when I asked for details. Certain travels he had spoken of to her never aligned with the stories he told me. She admitted sometimes he dodged questions about where he came from before they met. We pieced together the fragments and realized neither of us had ever held the complete picture. He had given us each a partial script. Enough to live by, never enough to see the whole play. I left that cafe shaken but strangely steadier. The betrayal felt less personal and more structural. It was not that he loved her more or me less. It was that he seemed to be working from a pattern, a design of duplications, that made it colder, more calculated. I walked home with the strange awareness that I had not been married to a man so much as bound to a role in an ongoing performance. When I confronted him again, I expected rage or at least denial. But he only sat quietly as if the weight of silence could shield him. He said there were things I did not want to know. His voice lacked menace, sounded more like fatigue, as though he had carried too many names for too long and felt the strain of keeping them from collapsing into each other. At first I thought this was theater, a tactic to push me back into confusion. But then the discoveries began. I found a set of bank accounts that did not appear in any records we had shared. Accounts with balances that rose and fell without explanation. I noticed deposits made under names I had never heard. One afternoon I stumbled on an envelope tucked behind the furnace filled with receipts tied to yet another identity. Not his, not the one she knew, something else entirely. Another day I traced a payment to a storage unit on the far side of town. I drove there alone with my hands shaking on the wheel. The key from the envelope fit the lock. Inside were boxes, photographs of him under different names. Letters written to people I had never heard of. Notes signed with handwriting that looked like his but not quite. As though someone had studied his hand and imitated it just enough to pass. The other woman and I became uneasy allies. We traded findings the way investigators trade evidence. We plotted his movements. We checked his stories against each other. Each discovery unraveled a deeper thread. It became clear he had not built two lives. He had built several. Each one stitched from half-truths. Each one just strong enough to stand if not pressed too hard. The boy she thought was his turned out not to be his son at all. That revelation hit her harder than it hit me. She had let him fold himself into the child's world with the trust of a mother reaching for stability. Yet even that bond was only another performance. But what unnerved me more than anything was the evidence of something larger. Notes tucked into folders with names neither of us recognized. Mentions of debts. References to promises. Documents that pointed to places he claimed to have been though neither of us had proof he had ever gone. The scope expanded beyond infidelity and lies. Touched something colder. Perhaps criminal. Perhaps stranger. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and replaying our 10 years together like a film reel. Every trip. Every shared laugh. Every plan. I wondered if I had ever met the man beneath all those layers or if he had only ever been a mask. I no longer felt like a betrayed wife. I felt like a witness dragged into a puzzle that was never meant to be solved. The longer I held that thought, the more it terrified me. Because once you realize you never knew someone at all, you begin to wonder if they ever truly existed. The collapse did not arrive all at once. Came in small implosions. A message that went unanswered. A meeting that fell apart. A story that contradicted itself too clearly to ignore. Each time I pressed him, his face carried the look of an animal cornered but too proud to flee. He no longer fought me with lies. He fought with silence. That silence carried more weight than denial ever could. She confronted him one evening at her home while I waited in the driveway. I heard the voices rise and then break into quiet. When he stepped out, he looked thinner than before. His eyes darted like someone scanning exits. He did not address me. He climbed into his car and drove away. That was the last time I saw him. His absence did not thunder. It seeped in like water through cracks. The kind you only notice once the walls begin to warp. Afterward, we expected explanation, closure, something solid to stand on. Instead, what came was erasure. The accounts emptied. The storage unit cleared. The papers vanished. It was as if he had dissolved into air. We reported what we knew, but the police shrugged. To them, it was a domestic matter. No crime. No theft beyond what could be dismissed as marital dispute. They heard us speak of multiple names and hidden documents, and they shook their heads as if we were exaggerating. They said some men run. That was the phrase they used. Some men run. But we knew better. He had not run in panic. He had folded his life like a map and slipped it into a pocket where no one could reach. The precision with which he vanished told me this had been rehearsed. Just as he rehearsed our lives. Just as he rehearsed his names. In the quiet that followed, she and I clung to each other in uneasy alliance. We compared every scrap, every inconsistency. We spoke of small things that had once seemed trivial but now rang with warning. I told her of the scar and the double answers. She told me of the time he refused to be photographed at an event because the lighting was too strong. We spoke of people who claimed to know him under names we had never heard. It became clear the web stretched further than either of us could trace. Nights grew heavier. I would lie awake in the bed that still carried his imprint and wonder how many women had lain awake the same way, wondering where he was, who he was, if he would come home. Perhaps there were more of us. Perhaps there had always been more. The thought no longer felt far-fetched. It felt inevitable. The house itself turned strange. Every photo frame looked staged. Every piece of furniture seemed like a set piece, as if I had been living inside a stage play without knowing the script. Friends asked gentle questions, but I never gave them the whole truth. How could I tell them that the man they thought they knew at our dinner parties was only one mask among many? One afternoon I drove past the storage unit again, though I knew it would be empty. I parked and sat there staring at the corrugated door. I pictured the boxes inside. The letters with unfamiliar names. The photographs that showed him smiling in places he had never spoken of. I thought of the handwriting that looked almost like his but not quite. And I felt a chill that had nothing to do with betrayal. It felt like standing at the edge of something older and darker. Something that lived in the shadows between names. The other woman told me once that she believed he was good. That he had shown her kindness. That he had treated her child with patience. I believed her. That frightened me more than if she had said he was cruel. A cruel man is easy to spot. A kind man who can vanish without a trace is something else entirely. As days stretched into weeks and then months, I stopped expecting him to return. But the unease did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Because it was not only the betrayal of a husband. It was the sense that I had brushed against a story much larger than myself. A story I was never meant to witness. And every time I remembered the look in his eyes the night I first confronted him, I knew I was right. It had not been guilt. It had not been shame. It had been fear. Fear does not vanish. It lingers. It seeps into corners where you least expect it. I carried his fear in my own chest long after he disappeared. I began to notice things I could not easily explain. Calls that came with no number attached. A voice that breathed on the line and then hung up. Envelopes slipped beneath my door containing nothing but blank paper. At first I thought it was paranoia, the mind filling silence with echoes. But then she began to report the same. Strange faces lingering outside her building. A car that idled on her street too often to be coincidence. We tried to rationalize. Maybe creditors. Maybe jealous ghosts of his other lives. But rational explanations broke apart under the weight of repetition. Too many glances held too long. Too many signs that someone wanted us to know we were being watched. Felt less like harassment and more like a reminder. A warning that we had stepped too close to something meant to remain hidden. I returned to the boxes in memory, though they were gone in reality. I could still see them. Photographs, letters, names I could not place. One letter mentioned a town I had never heard of in a state I had never visited. I searched for it one night and found nothing. Not a trace. It was as though the place existed only in the folds of those papers. That unsettled me more than any proof might have, because absence leaves wider holes than presence. The other woman grew quieter as the months passed. She spoke less often. When she did, her words carried the weight of someone pulling herself together for the sake of her child. Yet even she admitted she sometimes woke at night certain she heard him at the door. Not in flesh but in memory. The rhythm of keys. The weight of footsteps. The imprint of his rehearsed normalcy pressing into the present. I began sorting through the remnants of our shared life. Old bills. Holiday cards. Receipts. Every piece looked different under new light. Patterns emerged where before there was only clutter. Purchases made in cities he had never told me he visited. Gas charges in towns off the highways we never traveled. I traced them on a map and saw lines intersecting like threads. A network of paths carved by a man who never stayed still. Sometimes I thought about the women I did not know. The ones who never sat across from me in a cafe. The ones who might still believe his promises. I imagined them laughing in houses where his absence would one day settle like a stone. It was not jealousy that drove those thoughts. It was pity, because betrayal by itself can be healed. But to discover you never knew the man at all leaves a wound that does not close. One evening I sat on the porch with the last glass of wine from a bottle we had once saved for a celebration that never came. I stared into the quiet street and thought about how trust is spoken of as a bond. As a tie that holds two people together. But trust is also blindness. It is choosing not to see the cracks even when they line up like fractures across glass. I had chosen blindness. So had she. And he had built his world inside that choice. What stayed with me most was the moment of his departure. No words. No apology. Just the look of a man who knew the stage was collapsing and chose to step off before it fell. That look still lives in me. Carried no anger, no regret, only fear, as though even he did not fully understand the thing he had been serving. And that is what I returned to night after night. The sense that there was something larger than lies, larger than betrayal, a shadow he had lived beneath, something that reached into both our lives not because of who we were but because of what he carried, something that may still be watching. Time moved forward but the questions never left. I went back to work. I filled my days with routine. Yet underneath the rhythm of normal life ran a steady current of unease. Every stranger on the train looked like someone who might know him. Every letter without a return address felt like a test. I did not speak of this to friends because it sounded unhinged. To say that a man could vanish and leave behind nothing but fear and fragments made me sound like someone clinging to phantoms. But the fear was real. The fragments were sharp enough to cut. The other woman and I met less often. Our alliance turned to silence not out of anger but exhaustion. She had her child to protect. I had my own sanity to keep. We agreed in unspoken ways to set boundaries. Yet sometimes her name would flash on my phone late at night. A brief message. A detail she remembered. A small inconsistency. We traded those scraps like relics of a religion we no longer believed but could not discard. One night she told me something that kept me awake until dawn. She said her son had drawn a picture at school. A family portrait. In it stood herself, the boy, and him. But the boy had written a different name under his figure. A name neither of us recognized. A name she swore she had never spoken aloud. Children invent things. Children hear things. But that one detail gnawed at me. How many names had he worn? How many lives had he slipped into like costumes left hanging in a closet? I tried once to rebuild the trail. I searched for traces of the documents that had vanished. I called banks. I pressed for records. Each time I hit walls. Privacy laws. Shrugs. Disbelief. One clerk told me the account I described had never existed. Yet I had held the receipt in my hand. Either the paper had lied or the system had been scrubbed clean. Both possibilities chilled me. There were nights when I considered leaving the house entirely, packing and moving to another city, starting new with nothing familiar. But I stayed, perhaps out of stubbornness, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps because I feared the shadow would follow me regardless of distance. You can outrun a man. You cannot outrun what drives him. Memories began to shift in texture. A laugh once warm now sounded rehearsed. A touch once tender now felt like performance. Even our arguments seemed staged. I began to suspect that nothing had been genuine, that perhaps I had been married to an echo, a reflection cast against a wall. The thought hollowed me, but it also freed me, because once you accept that the life was an illusion, you stop trying to fix it. You stop waiting for explanation. Yet every so often something happened that drew me back into doubt. A bill arrived addressed in his name but postmarked after his disappearance. A voicemail played static and then half a sentence that sounded like him. A shadow lingered too long at the end of my street. Were these accidents? Were they warnings? Or were they reminders that he had never fully left? I began to write everything down. Every inconsistency, every strange detail. Not to solve it but to record it. A private archive of the life I had unknowingly lived. The pages filled quickly. Lists of names, places, dates. I read over them at night and realized I was no longer searching for him. I was searching for the shape of the thing that had used him as its mask. And in that search I understood the truest betrayal was not his lies to me. The truest betrayal was his fear. Because fear does not live alone. Fear points to something larger. Something that even he could not control. Something I might never see yet would always feel breathing just beyond the edges of my ordinary life. Years have passed and I have rebuilt the outer shell of my life. New furniture, fresh paint, a job that keeps me moving through the hours without giving me too much time to look back. Friends see me smile and they believe I am healed. They say I am stronger now. They tell me I am free. But freedom is a complicated word. You can leave a man behind. You cannot so easily leave behind the shadow he carried. The other woman remarried eventually. She moved across state lines and built a steadier life for her son. We speak rarely now. A message once or twice a year. A photograph sent in spring. A holiday greeting. Our bond remains, but it lives in the background like an old scar you only notice when the weather shifts. Yet whenever we do speak, the subject always bends back to him. She asks if I have heard anything. I ask her the same. The answer never changes. Nothing. Not a trace. Still the world delivers echoes. A name overheard in a crowd that makes my head turn. A figure on a train whose posture is his. A news story about fraud or missing persons that feels close enough to burn. Each time I remind myself it could be coincidence. Each time the fear beneath the memory tells me it is not. What unsettles me most is the lingering question of purpose. If it had been only infidelity, I could place it in the realm of human weakness. If it had been only money, I could file it under greed. But the patterns pointed to something stranger. Accounts that led nowhere. Towns that did not exist. Letters written in a hand almost his but not quite. It felt less like deception for pleasure and more like devotion to a code none of us could see. I sometimes wonder if he was running from something or running for it. If all his names were shields to protect him or doors that allowed him entry into another design. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. The truth is I will never know. And that unknowing has become my inheritance. The house where we lived together still carries that echo. Every photograph that once showed us smiling now feels like evidence. Every holiday memory plays like a rehearsal. I look at those images and wonder which name he wore that day, which life he returned to once I slept. Whether I was ever more than an interval in the greater script. What remains with me more vividly than anything else is his eyes that night when I first confronted him. People expect to see guilt in such a moment, or shame, or anger, but what I saw was fear, pure and unguarded. The fear of a man who knew the walls were closing in not because of me but because something larger pressed against them. Something neither of us could name. So I move forward with that memory lodged inside me. A quiet reminder. Trust is not always broken in a single moment. Sometimes it was never there to begin with. Sometimes you discover you were walking through a labyrinth that has no center. A design meant only to keep you circling. And if one day a stranger knocks on my door and introduces herself with a familiar story, if she sits across from me in a cafe with horror dawning in her eyes, I will not be surprised, because the performance never ended. It only shifted to another stage. And somewhere out there he walks beneath another name carrying that same fear. Fear of being seen for what he truly was, or perhaps for what was always standing just behind him,